Game 1 of the 1907 World Series between the returning National League champion Chicago Cubs and the American League champions the Detroit Tigers behind manager Hugh Jennings. The series begins in Chicago at the Cubs' home, the West Side grounds, and features the pitching matchup of Wild Bill Donovan for the Tigers and the wonderfully named Orville Overall for the Cubs. Scoring action begins in the fourth inning for the Cubs when Frank Chance gets on base with a walk and reaches second on a sacrifice bunt by Harry Steinfeld. A single by catcher Johnny Kling scores Chance for the first run of the series. The Tigers attempted to even it up in the fifth on a risky double steal. Davy Jones stole second successfully, but that wasn't enough of a distraction for Boss Schmidt to take home as he was tagged out by Steinfeld between the bases. The Tigers rallied in the eighth with more than a little help from a poor defensive performance by the Cubs. With one out, Davy Jones reached on a base hit and then stole second base when no one was there to cover the bag. Herman Germany Schaefer hit a ground ball to short, which was fumbled by Joe Tinker, allowing Jones to take third and Schaefer to reach first safely. Schaefer then proceeded to steal second base. Tigers center fielder Sam Crawford punched a single into right field to score both base runners, allowing the Tigers to take the lead 2-1. A wild throw to home plate by Cubs right fielder Frank Schulte allowed Crawford to land safely at third for the second Cubs error of the inning. With a runner on third and one out, the Tigers' young star right fielder Ty Cobb fired a line drive that deflected off-pitcher Orville Overall, but the pitcher made a quick recovery and threw to third to catch Sam Crawford between the bases. Crawford was caught in a classic pickle, but things continued to go askew for the Cubs when catcher Johnny Kling dropped a throw from third baseman Harry Steinfeld for the third Cub error of the inning, and Crawford scrambled back to third untouched. Claude Rossman followed with a fly ball to center field, which allowed both runners to tag and advance, driving in Crawford for the third run of the inning. In the bottom of the ninth, Chicago quickly got two base runners on when Frank Chance hit a single and Harry Steinfeld was hit by a pitch. Kling popped up a bunt for the first out, but an error by Tigers third baseman Bill Coughlin allowed Johnny Evers to reach first and load up the bases for the Cubs. Wildfire Frank Schulte bounced a grounder to the pitcher for the out at first base, but all three runners advanced on the play, and Chance scored the second run of the game for the Cubs. Still down by one run, Chance sent pinch hitter Del Howard to bat for Joe Tinker. Bill Donovan had two strikes on Howard, and the Tigers were one strike away from taking game one of the series. Donovan blew one past the Cubs pinch hitter for strike three, but Tigers catcher Boss Schmidt dropped the pitch and could not recover the ball fast enough to get Howard at first base, and the Cubs tied the game when Harry Steinfeld scored on the play. The Cubs attempted to wrap it up right there with a double steal, but Johnny Evers was caught at home plate, and a World Series game was about to go into extra innings for the first time in history. In the 10th inning, the Cubs continued to run wild on the base pass with 3 stolen bases in the inning. The Cubs left the bases loaded in the 11th inning, but were still unable to score. And after the 12th inning, the game was called off due to darkness for the first tie game in World Series history with a score of 3-3. So we go into Game 2 with no win for either side and a tie game officially in the books. Game 2 of the 1907 World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Detroit Tigers at the West Side grounds in Chicago. We go into Game 2 with neither team possessing the lead due to the tie in Game 1, which went 12 innings and was called due to darkness. On the mound for Game 2, we have George Mullen for the Tigers and Jack Feister for the Cubs. Detroit took the lead early on in the second inning when Claude Rossman rolled a triple up the line into left field. After the next batter struck out, the Tigers catcher for the day, Fred Payne, blooped a single into shallow left, driving home Rossman and making the score 1-0 Tigers. The Cubs came back in their half of the second when singles by Johnny Kling, Johnny Evers, and Frank Schulte loaded the bases. The Tigers pitcher, George Mullen, who had walked at least 100 batters in each of his last 5 seasons, proceeded to throw 4 balls to Joe Tinker. With nowhere to put him, everyone advanced on the walk, and Johnny Kling scored to tie the game 1-1. We get another historic World Series first in the third inning when Tigers manager Huey Jennings was ejected from the game for arguing with umpire Hank O'Day. Germany Schaefer was caught stealing at second, and Jennings was outraged. And yes, Jennings is doing something like this in most of the pictures of him. It's like a war cry or a battle cry or something, I don't know. In the Cubs half of the fourth, Joe Tinker led off with an infield single and moved to second on a bunt by Jack Feister. Tinker stole second and then came home on a single by Jimmy Slagle. Slagle followed this with another steal of second base. Jimmy Sheckard brought another runner home on a double to right field to make the score 3-1 Cubs. Chicago continued to lean into the running game as Sheckard attempted to steal third base but was caught for the second out. And this was all the scoring in the game, as the remaining innings only saw 4 base runners total until Jack Feister got the final out on a bunt in front of the plate. Feister spreading out 9 or maybe 10 hits depending on which source you check, with a lot of help from the Cubs defense. The infield turned 2 double plays and catcher Johnny Kling threw out 3 Tiger base runners attempting to steal. Quite a turnaround from their sloppy performance in Game 1. And the Tigers' George Mullen, despite his usual issues with walks, only allowed 3 runners to reach via base on balls, although one of these walked in a run. The Cubs take the lead in the series 1-0 with a tie game included as we move on to the third game in Chicago. Game 3 of the 1907 World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Detroit Tigers. Game 3 was the third consecutive game played at the Westside Grounds in Chicago due to the tie in Game 1, with the Cubs leading the series 1-0. On the mound for Game 3, we have Ed Seaver for the Tigers and Ed Ruhlbach for the Cubs in a battle of the Eds. The Cubs got off to a quick lead in the second inning. Harry Steinfeld led off with a double and then advanced to third on a sacrifice bunt by Johnny Kling. Johnny Evers followed this with a double to right field to score Steinfeld for the Cubs' first run. The Cubs still led 1-0 going into their half of the fourth inning. With one out, Johnny Kling and Johnny Evers hit back-to-back singles into right field to put runners on first and third. Wildfire Frank Schulte followed with a third consecutive single to score Kling, but Tigers center fielder Sam Crawford fired the ball back in time to catch Johnny Evers between third and home for out number 2. Frank Schulte, meanwhile, advanced to second. Joe Tinker hit a fly ball into left field, but Davy Jones missed the catch for an error, allowing Frank Schulte to score and Joe Tinker to scramble all the way to third base. Ed Ruhlbach then did himself a favor and knocked his own single into right field to score Tinker for the third run of the inning, making the score 4-0 Cubs. That was it for Tigers pitcher Ed Seaver, as Hugh Jennings elected to bring in a third guy named Ed to pitch in this game when Ed Killian came on in relief in the fifth. The Cubs continued to be trouble for Killian, as Frank Chance hit a double to center field and proceeded to score on a single by Harry Steinfeld. After recording out number 2, Johnny Evers hit a ground rule double, but Killian was able to get out of the jam to end the inning with 2 runners on, the Cubs working a 5-0 shutout. The Tigers put their only run on the board in the 6th when Ed Killian led off with a single and Davy Jones walked to put runners on first and second. A ground ball to third base by Jeremy Schaefer allowed the Cubs to turn a 5-4-3 double play, but the Tigers pitcher Killian reached third base safely. A Sam Crawford single allowed Killian to score the Tigers' only run of the game. The Tigers left 2 runners on in the 7th, but the game ended with the final score of 5-1 Cubs. An excellent outing from Ed Ruhlbach as 6 hits led to only 1 run for the Tigers. The Chicago Cubs now lead the series 2-0 with 1 tie as we finally head to Detroit for Game 4. Game 4 of the 1907 World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Detroit Tigers. With the Cubs up in the series 2-0, including a tie in Game 1, we move to Detroit for the first World Series games ever played in the city. The pitching matchup for Game 4 at Bennett Park in Detroit features a rematch of Game 1 with Orville Overall on the mound for the Cubs and Wild Bill Donovan for the Tigers. The game remained scoreless until the bottom of the 4th. With 2 outs, the Tigers' Ty Cobb hit a triple to center field. A single by Claude Rossman scored Cobb and Detroit took the lead 1-0. Bill Coughlin followed with a base hit and Boss Schmidt walked to load the bases. The Tigers were unable to capitalize, however, as Overall struck out shortstop Charlie O'Leary to snuff out the potential rally. The game was halted by a rain delay in the top half of the 5th, and when play resumed, the Cubs immediately mounted a comeback in the bottom half. Johnny Evers hit a grounder to short and reached on an error by O'Leary on the throw to first, and Frank Schulte worked a walk to put runners on first and second. Joe Tinker moved both runners up with a sacrifice bunt, and Orville Overall drove in the Cubs' first run on a single, sending Evers home and Schulte to third. Jimmy Slagle gave Chicago the lead with a sacrifice fly to left to score Schulte before the inning was over, the score now 2-1 Cubs. The 7th inning featured another Chicago rally and a whole lot of bunting. Frank Schulte laid one down for a single, and Joe Tinker followed with a sacrifice bunt. But the Tigers were unable to record an out on the play, as pitcher Bill Donovan's throw to first base was not in time to get Tinker. Orville Overall followed up with a third bunt, this one a sacrifice, that moved the runners to second and third with 1 out. Jimmy Slagle hit a ground ball to short for a fielder's choice, but Charlie O'Leary's throw to home plate went wide for an error and allowed Schulte to score a run. The Cubs now had runners on the corners and still only 1 out. Jimmy Sheckard laid down the 4th bunt of the inning for a single and drove in Joe Tinker for the second run. Frank Chance grounded to third base for the force out on Sheckard at second, while Slagle was held at third. The Cubs continued to pressure Detroit on the base paths by attempting a double steal. Slagle was able to steal home for another run, but Frank Chance was caught at second base to end the inning. The Cubs with a 3-run rally, including 4 bunts, and the ball never left the infield during the inning. It's now 5-1 Chicago. The Cubbies tacked on a final run in their half of the 9th. Donovan walked Joe Tinker, and Orville Overall moved the runner to second with a sacrifice bunt. A Jimmy Slagle single to left field drove in the final run of the game, putting the Cubs on top by a score of 6-1. Orville Overall with 5 innings of 1-hit ball after the rain delay, allowing 6 hits total with 6 strikeouts and only 2 walks. The Cubs now lead the series 3-0 with 1 tie as we move on to Game 5. Game 5 of the 1907 World Series between the Chicago Cubs and the Detroit Tigers. The Tigers are on the brink of elimination as the Cubs go into the series leading 3-0 with a tie in Game 1. On the mound today in Bennett Park, Detroit, we have Mordecai Brown starting for the Cubs in his first game of the series versus George Mullen for the Tigers. Left fielder Jimmy Slagle led the game off with a walk for the Cubs. After Jimmy Sheckert flied out to left and Del Howard struck out, Slagle stole second to put himself in scoring position. The Cubs took the lead when the runner scored on a single by Harry Steinfeld, putting the Cubs up 1-0. Mullen then got Johnny Kling to fly out to right to end the inning. The Cubs put another run up in the second inning. Johnny Evers started by grounding to third, but reached safely on an error by first baseman Claude Rossman on the catch. Frank Schulte popped a bunt back to the catcher for the first out, but Joe Tinker followed up with a single to put runners on first and second. Typical of the entire series, the Cubs then started running as Evers and Tinker executed a double steal to advance to second and third. Mordecai Brown drew a walk to load up the bases and bring up the top of the Cubs batting order. Jimmy Slagle tapped a ground ball to second, and Johnny Evers scored an unearned run to make it 2-0 Cubs. The Tigers threatened to put a run on the board in the fourth inning when Sam Crawford led off with a ground rule double to right field. Ty Cobb struck out, and Claude Rossman hit a single to center to put runners on the corners. But Three-Finger Brown got out of the situation unscathed, coaxing a pop foul to the catcher and a flyout to left to end the inning and strand both runners. The Cubs managed to load the bases in the top of the ninth when Frank Schulte got on board with a 2-out single and stole second, followed by a walk to Joe Tinker and an error by Tigers third baseman Germany Schaefer, which allowed Mordecai Brown to reach safely. George Mullen struck out Jimmy Slagle to end the threat and send it to the bottom of the ninth, where the Cubs would have to defend a 2-run lead to take home the championship. Despite a single by Claude Rossman, the Tigers were unable to score, and the Chicago Cubs won Game 5 by a score of 2-0. Mordecai Brown with a complete game shutout, allowing only one walk in the very first inning with 4 strikeouts. The only time the Tigers had more than one runner on base was in the fourth, as Brown kept traffic to a minimum. The Chicago Cubs won their first World Series 4-0, including the tie in Game 1, for the first sweep in World Series history despite the extra game. The 1907 series included a record 25 combined stolen bases by both teams, with the Cubs keeping the Tigers on their feet with a total of 18 swipes. In the 5 games combined, the Tigers were only able to score 6 runs total, 3 of them in the tied first game and then 1 in each of the next 3 before being shut out in Game 5. The Chicago Cubs with excellent pitching performances from all 4 of their starters, with overall Feister, Rulebach, and Brown going the distance in all 5 games and bringing home the championship for the Cubs.